Another state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the state.
Welcome to the Black Miss Podcast. I'm your host, Too Black. It is just me today. The team will be back next month interviewing Dr. Layla Brown. And today's myth is Afrocentricity equals Pan-Africanism, or the claim that both of these concepts are interchangeable without distinction. And this is often made, there are similarities, of course, which we'll discuss today, but often people throw these things into the same bag without really recognizing there's differences, and even that there's different types of Pan-Africanism. So if you go to like the Wikipedia page of Afrocentrism, for instance, you'll find that there's a reference immediately on the, it says parts of the politics series on Pan-Africanism. So Afrocentricity and Pan-Africanism are naturally like interchangeable. And in conversation, you often hear this, whether it's with people that call folks Hotep, and they'll say it's a bastardized version of Pan-Africanism and Afrocentricity, and these things kind of just get collapsed, or even what people think is Hotep, whatever that means. The reactionaries essentially becomes this caricature of all things Pan-Africanism, all things Afrocentricity, and they have the African beads, and they might have the kufi on, and they talk like this, we gonna unite the, whatever, and it just becomes a caricature. And I think the problem is that it's not clear what these things really mean and why it matters to, understand these distinctions. So, today we're talking with a scholar who, I've been on Last Hope Intellectual with Dr. Sharice Burton-Staley, who's also been on this show, with Dr. Layla Brown, who knows these things much better than I do. She is a professor at Northeastern University, and she is a lifetime member essentially of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, GC. And as I said, she's currently an assistant professor of cultural anthropology and Africana studies, and an affiliate faculty in women's, gender, and sexuality studies, all at Northeastern University. So I'm going to speak with Dr. Layla today, Dr. Brown, to get a better understanding of these distinctions. And then we're going to delve into a debate that occurred back in 1996 between Molefi Asante, who is the originator of Afrocentricity as an academic theory, maybe not Afrocentricity as a just kind of a community concept, but as an academic theory in 1980. And then Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael. They had a debate back in 1996. The actual discussion was called the Africa in the Future, but it was a debate about Pan-Africanism versus Afrocentricity. So regardless of what you agree with, where you stand, you get to hear the back and forth, and we comment on it. And then we're also going to get into there was a Pan-African conference, or that's what you want to call it, Pan-African Summit in Ghana just back in January, I believe, hosted by Vic Mensa and Chance the Rapper and some other Chicago rappers. And they also had the Black Star Line Festival. So Dr. Layla was there. So she's going to give some commentary on that and whether that was a great expression of Pan-Africanism. And we're also going to talk about some interesting occurrences happening, on the west coast of Africa with Burkina Faso and Guinea and Mali and so on and so forth. So it's great episodes, great interview, really enjoyed it. Before we get into it, I do want to shout out the few patrons. We were a little low this time, so if you've not subscribed to be a patron of our Patreon, please do. QKR Anarchist, looks like Keisha Ford and Alfred. So thank you to you three. I know it was the holidays, so people kind of tapered off. So now that we back up, if anybody wants to sign up, please feel free to do so. And always remember, if you want to hear the full conversation, we usually break our interviews up into 2 episodes. If you want to hear the full conversation in one, that's up early on our Patreon, just to give you, some of the ideas, some of the benefits you can get. Also, do want to start informing people that we're going to be in Chicago live as a crew May 4th at DePaul University. I do want to start promoting that early for those who listen in Chicago, people, our fans, our listeners who are in Chicago. Just letting you know, we don't have the exact time and location figured out yet. So, but just for those who are in the area, whether you're in Chicago or somewhere around there, if you want to see us in person, if you want to see us do a recording, we'll be in Chicago in May 4th. That's what it's looking at. If the date changes, of course, we'll let y'all know. And as more information comes into being, we'll let y'all know. But just want to start tapping in with that and letting y'all know that we will be like in person recording an episode and debunking a myth live. And we're looking forward to that. So, and if anyone else wants to bring us out to do that, we are open for that opportunity as well. But otherwise, we're going to get into it. All right. All right. So y'all heard the intro. So we got Dr. Layla here. This is a reunion of the show that I used to be on. Some of you may or may not know, The Last Dope Intellectual. That show is no longer, it's not in syndication, nor does it exist currently. But this has been a long time coming. I mean, we've obviously known each other for a little bit, but I've never had you on here, so that's my fault. But thanks for being on here. So how you been?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to finally be here since you finally deemed me worthy to be a guest.
I just want the record to show that I've been asking about this for a few months now, though. But
okay.
All right. So yeah, before we get into any of the clarifying questions or anything, just the idea of Afrocentricity equally Pan-Africanism, and I guess the general sentiment that these things are all one and the same. And in my intro, I gave some examples of how that's happened in scholarship, but I also think it's harder to quantify, but it does also just happen in kind of general conversation. So I'm just curious how you view that kind of discourse and just in your experience.
It's something that I really struggle with because even when I teach my intro to Africana studies courses, I always have weeks dedicated to Afrocentricity, Black nationalism, Pan-Africanism to try to think those things through differently. I think that on the surface, the idea of Afrocentricity, which is in a very general sense to sort of center Africa in the way that we think about ourselves and where we find our sort of general analysis. I think that there's a lot of weight to that concept, but because Afrocentricity has become a sort of field of study, a school of thought in its own right, it is important to distinguish it from what I think is the more sort of politically oriented understandings of Pan-Africanism that I operate based on. So I think, for people who are invested in Black people's freedom and struggle, we have to know the distinctions and not even necessarily always buy into the beefs that people have about them, but we do have to know the distinctions that exist between how people are deploying certain terms, what they mean by them, who they're referencing, and what they're actually calling for. And I think that for a person like me, the reason why Afrocentricity becomes a less powerful category is because I don't necessarily always see it as something that is operationalizing a vision for our future as much as it is about a sort of internal self-worth, which I think has its own value,
right?
But it's not enough.
Right. Yeah, I think A lot of us who are, I don't, for lack of a better term, who are kind of into these kind of things, even who may arrive past it, go through more of an Afrocentric phase, even if it's generically speaking, like, you know, especially if we didn't grow up with any consciousness around us. Like I feel like I definitely went through that phase. I definitely don't feel like I'm there now, but I think I went through that phase. And learning about, you know, that Black people did things beyond slavery, essentially. Again, to just kind of like overgeneralize it, like learning that Black people did other things, or that we were called other things beyond even Black, right? And just learning that, and now and then being kind of angry that no one ever told you this, you know, and that having its own rage to it.
Mm-hmm.
But that, even though I think that's a good start, because at least it gets you to start thinking about other things, I don't know if that doesn't inherently bring you to any real political vision, right? That can go a lot of different places, as we'll discuss, you know, later. But
and I mean, like you said, I think in a lot of ways it's reactive, right? It's a reaction to the omission and the, you know, the obfuscation of Black people's contributions to life really in the Americas. I mean, that's really what it comes, that the way that most people sort of understand Afrocentricity. It is about responding to the fact that when we're in school, if we're lucky, what we learn about African people maybe starts with, if you have any pre-enslavement history, then it'll be something like Ghana, Mali, Songhai empires, maybe. And then somehow you jump, exactly, like it's like 3 pages each, right? And then you go from that moment.
Yeah, I'm from Indiana, so
you go from that moment. And the thing is, I ask my students about this every semester, and you go from this moment to the period of enslavement, then you have enslavement, emancipation, and people, you know, on this side of the Atlantic, people talk about emancipation, but they don't talk about African independence movements at all. And then somehow you jump to civil rights. You got Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and then Barack Obama, right? Like that's literally like how we sort of exist in a sort of mainstream history. And so I think in that basic sense, I think in that regard, Afrocentricity as a sort of like a pedagogical or methodological tool for teaching in school, I think is important, right? To make sure that we understand the importance of teaching African children about African history in all of its sort of fullness and robustness. But unfortunately, I don't think that that's how it really gets sort of used and deployed these days. So.
Well, I think what you end up seeing is because of what we just talked about, where you don't get the education, you also don't learn even like basic intellectual frameworks. So you don't know how to what to do with it. Like, so it's just kind of thrown on you. And, you know, we see that especially now in this like internet age or whatever, where there's this information floating everywhere and people are using it for various things. So you don't, like, you learn about it, and all the other things, like we were talking off camera about Nkrumah and trying to build out a more like a more disciplined philosophy on how to view yourself in the world. Like, we don't get any of that. So even when you tell somebody that, you know, Egyptians were African, or when you tell somebody that Black folks did this or invented that or accomplished this or contributed this to civilization, the framework that we receive that is so backwards. Yep. You know, because of education as well, that I think it leads to the very distortion we're talking about, where you don't even have a sense of like what's what. It's just like, all I know is I just got a bunch of white people shit, and then there's this Black African shit over here, and like I'm trying to reclaim that, you know. Like,
yeah, and that's why we mistakenly spend a lot of time celebrating the notion that we were once kings and queens, right? And I think that comes from a particular moment in time, which again is that kind of reaction to this notion that we as African people are people without history, right? People without culture somehow, responding to that, thinking that we need any kind of parity with sort of European notions of monarchies, and how complicated that is for us as African people when we know the degree to which those who had monarchical power were engaging in our subjugation as people, right? And in the process of selling us off, right? And so I think about often one of the things my father always said to me is like, we don't got to think about ourselves as kings and queens. We were laborers, we were workers, and there's everything wonderful and great about being normal people who labor and who love and who engage in normal everyday activities. And we don't have to have believed that we were kings and queens to be able to have pride in who we once were, right?
Right.
And so I think that that's the pitfalls of the approach that Afrocentricity takes to thinking about African history, as opposed to my understanding of Pan-Africanism.
Right. And just one last point before we get into like defining these things. I think Walter Rodney noted in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa that the countries and the nations in Africa during colonialism and enslavement that were less monarchical or less tied up in the kind of kings and queens thing, they were more able to actually resist the imposition of European, domination.
Mm-hmm.
They were more open to resisting that. Like when you look at the records, they were more likely to hold on to what they had for longer periods of time than the folks who were more tied into that. And others have noted that some of our formations prior to the interruption, led to some of that. And that's why maybe the idea of just returning back to those things without having any like reflection on what that means for now sometimes isn't always a positive. So we talked a lot about Pan-African or about Afrocentricity. We haven't said much about Pan-Africanism, but since we're on Afrocentricity, what is Afrocentricity? Like, so we can start getting some clear distinctions here. Like, so as a Black Studies Africana scholar, like, what is Afrocentricity?
So again, I mean, I guess the person you kind of go to as the definitive person in the field as a scholar to think about the field or school of thought of Afrocentricity would be Molefi Asante, because he, has self-designated himself as the person who coined the term. Although I think we can although we know we're very well aware of the fact that people were already committed to centering Africa prior to his ability to formulate Afrocentrism or Afrocentricity into I guess a more streamlined school of thought. But again, like I said earlier, literally this notion, and one thing I do appreciate about Molefi Asante's understanding of Afrocentricity is that it is about the centering of Africa for African people, in the same way that he makes an argument that any kind of Asian centrism or Eurocentrism or whatever is about understanding what a people need in order to be and feel dignified, right? And so that when you teach children who are African children, when you teach children who are Asian children, you have to be conscious and aware of the fact that you need to give them or offer up images or histories that affirm themselves, that affirm them as human beings, that say we were and are contributors to history, right? And so, I do appreciate that about his understanding of Afrocentricity. It's not about saying that everyone needs to have the same type of focus on Africa, but that as African people, we have to look back to our own histories, our own past, and think about what that means for ourselves in the present, right? And so that's where I think I find the most use of Afrocentricity, when you think about how do you bring about a curriculum that is life-affirming, right? That dignifies people. And you do that by making sure that you're not only teaching your students European texts or even ideologies, right? And when you think about like how certain value judgments are laid out. So, I mean, in that sense, there's a kind of general understanding of Afrocentricity in that way that I think is useful in terms of classroom pedagogy and methodology. I think it's deployed more broadly, in a way that makes us sort of engage in a cultural nationalism, which I think ironically, and this is one of my issues with it, it actually does very little to make us think about Africa. So in a lot of ways, Afrocentricity in our sort of contemporary moment is really a Black centricity, which is about a sort of Black American experience.
Yeah, especially nowadays.
Yes, with the kind of post moment of the transatlantic slave trade or the illegal trafficking of Africans. When we see it now, I don't know that people, other than maybe to some degree, like maybe when it comes to clothing, I don't necessarily know that it really helps us think about Africa as a place that exists in the present. That's the other thing, right? Like a lot of what Afrocentricity does is it allows us to think through ancient Kemet and these ancient empires, and even there, right? Not necessarily questioning what it means to exist as an empire and sort of class relations. I don't know that Afrocentricity in that way does enough to interrogate class relations, economic status, and again, I think it's very U.S. Black centered. In a way that really kind of belies the name, right? Is in a lot of ways, it's really not Afrocentric because it's very Black centric in terms of our Black experience in the U.S. So that's kind of my general overview, I would say, of Afrocentricity.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and I think that's that last point you said too, because I think sometimes it feels like there's a linear line that gets drawn, and that line seems to lead back to America. So. Like it might start in Africa and kind of an abstract, but it seems that it leads back here. On one level, even though I don't think that that's applied well, I think it makes sense because you're trying to deal with your experience here, since that's the people who essentially, at least with Asante, that's someone in America who invented it, so they're trying to figure out what Africans in America can do, but it's spoken of as a universal. Right, it's not spoken of, to your point, as just this like kind of Black American or whatever that it even means, or Black people in America or Africans in America or whatever. Like it's not even spoken. It's spoken as this universal thing that any African anywhere across the diaspora can pick up. When I don't know if it applies the same way. I mean, even in the States, depending on where you're from, the experience is different, right? So let alone outside of, in the rest of the diaspora. So it's not like every Black Briton has the same experience either, And then I think some people, this is where people use it to, when we get to Pan-Africanism, they kind of use this stuff to bash any of these concepts because they say it's so cartoonish that it's not even relevant. And that's kind of how we get like Pan-Africanism really takes. It's funny how Afrocentricity, if anyone wanted to make those criticisms, that you would think it would go towards Afrocentricity, but it's actually Pan-Africanism, the things that gets conflated with Afrocentricity. From what I've read and from what I just see, that seems to take the most hits on this idea of flattening Africa. Pretty much every criticism you just unleashed tends to get laid at the feet of Pan-Africanism more than it does on Afrocentricity, even though Afrocentricity, I think, is more guilty of these things. Pan-Africanism, which again we haven't discussed as much, and I think often gets associated with something I don't want to talk about too much today, but people throw around the word Hotep and stuff like that, which I've tried to just get out of my lingo, honestly. But like it slips out here and there. But like but when for the few folks who don't know what that means, like in the derogatory way, if you're called a Hotep, you're the caricature is some kind of like reactionary, homophobic, Black male nationalist, pork chop nationalist, even though anyone of any gender can be that. But the archetype is a Dr. Umar kind of character, who wants kind of like a male supremacist.
Who ironically calls himself the Prince of Pan-Africanism.
Yeah.
This is part of the problem.
Yeah, that's why I bring him up. But because it's usually when you'll see like people with kufis, a joke or like a cartoon with a kufi, and it's in memes and stuff like that. And it's this kind of bastardization of it. So I think and this is why I'm happy to have this conversation, because I think sometimes that image and just honestly, a lot of folks don't want to be associated with that for various reasons, just kind of dissuades folks from the idea of Pan-Africanism, from the idea of embracing Africa at all, and actually leans into the stuff you were saying with Afrocentricity, where it's just very much, I'm just focused on my Black American thing. So all that being said, what is Pan-Africanism? Can it be defined as one thing? Does it have multiple definitions? How should we understand it? And then after that, like, how should we understand it in relationship to Afrocentricity?
Yeah. I mean, it definitely has multiple definitions and or uses. So I will start with the one that I'm using operationalize. So as a member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party (GC), which was the party that Kwame Nkrumah called for in the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, the idea of Pan-Africanism is an objective, right? A political objective, and it is a political objective that says we are working towards the total liberation and unification of Africa under scientific socialism. And this comes from the notion. So when Nkrumah was living abroad, living in the U.S. studying, one of the things that he noticed, and a lot of the different so-called Western educated elites on the continent noticed that, when there's this understanding of the idea of linked fate, right? And so we understand that the political, economic, cultural, social state of Africa has direct bearing on how we as African descendants exist and live out in the world. And as long as the continent of Africa is in this in this neglected and or abused and or exploited state, we as African people will continue to be neglected, abused, exploited, treated like second-class citizens wherever we are, right? And so no matter whether or not we were born on the continent, live on the continent, the idea of a linked fate to Africa as a geographic unit and as a political unit, as a cultural unit, means that whatever the sort of conditions that exist in Africa will continue to impact us. And so that no matter where we are, we have to be struggling for the economic, political, cultural independence and self-determination of Africa as a continent. And so that is the sort of working definition of Pan-Africanism that I work with and operationalize. However, there's also, you can utilize the term Pan-African in a very sort of geographic sense to literally just say across Africa, which can but doesn't necessarily acknowledge that sort of political objective. And one of the things that Kwame Nkrumah always said is that, the liberation or the independence of Ghana means nothing without the liberation and independence of all of the rest of the African continent. And he meant that in a very practical sense, but also in a more sort of idealistic kind of political, philosophical sense too. Because if you have a small territory that, because for whatever reason, right, because of the history of cash crops and during the colonial period, because of the histories of borders, because of all of this sort of foreign imposition, Ghana cannot maintain its independence if it does not grow the support of people around it that can help maintain that independence, right? And that extends to the entire continent. And so that's an important thing to sort of understand, like, to think about Pan-Africanism as we want to always make these arguments that Egypt, whatever ethnic groups exist in Egypt are somehow distinct from all the ethnic groups that exist in West Africa and South Africa. We know that. We know that we speak different languages, we practice different religions, we believe different things. The flattening of Africa is not about flattening of the people, right? It is about an understanding of the common history of struggle that we have, and knowing that if we do not unite, we will never overcome that history, right?
Right.
And so for me, that's the definition of Pan-Africanism I operate. But like I said, people use a definition of Pan-Africanism that in many ways is indistinguishable from what we talked about earlier in terms of Afrocentricity. Or that is even, again, just this general generic geographic term, which is just to describe a phenomenon of across Africa. But there is a very particular economic and political impetus behind the definition of Pan-Africanism that I utilize and operate.
Right. And it seems like the simplest way I could derive from all of that is like Pan-Africanism is an objective. And I think it's sometimes applied as kind of loosely as an ideology, but I don't quite know when people say that. It seems like they're actually just saying Afrocentricity is an ideology, even though that could but it's it's a political objective. And if Afrocentricity has any use, it would be as an ideology. It's not a political objective. And I think that's the kind of cleanest way to distinguish the two, regardless of how you feel about them. Say what?
I said, I think that's a very distinct way to put it. I mean, because even we're not talking about negritude, but negritude exists in that same kind of category as Afrocentricity. Like it has its, uses, and it's really sort of thinking about our sort of cultural contributions, but that would be the closer thing to the ideology, whereas Pan-Africanism for me is a political objective, the way that I understand it based on my own political trajectory.
Right. And I think the geographic point is important too, because it helps us get out of that kind of just cultural, and I don't even want to bash cultural so much, because I think even that gets watered down to mean anything, but that kind of abstract, I should say, like sense of just being African, and anything we do is like revolutionary because we're just African and we did it, that kind of like, there's no measurement of what we're doing. But if you think about it geographically, like if we got time, we'll get to it, Mali and Guinea, like there's a sense of, like you said, shared fate in a very material way. Like it's easier for us to have sovereignty if we can protect the sovereignty and unify with others, as opposed to expecting us to maintain our sovereignty while we're at war with the entire colonial world. It's just harder to maintain your own. And Nkrumah learned this, like in real time. Like, we talked about in the last month how he was eventually overthrown. And a lot of folks learned this lesson because they did not have the support, across the continent or even across the world. And that's why there were different blocks. Right, whether you like those blocks, is why there was the third world. That's why there is non-alignment. Is why there even was the socialist bloc, or even the European, bloc. Like there's an understanding that by doing that, we can maintain a certain level of existence, But otherwise,
and autonomy.
Yeah.
I mean, even when even within the revolutionary Pan-Africanists, there were still disagreements and disputes over how things should be handled. Like, and for instance, when Lumumba was in trouble in the Congo, Kwame and Sekou Toure had a disagreement about how that should be dealt with. Lumumba wanted to ask UN troops to come in, and Nkrumah wasn't necessarily against that. Sekou Toure wanted to send Guinean forces because he's like, we can't trust these motherfuckers. Like we can't let the UN like they're literally doing their bidding, and history proves that he was right. Like they could not trust.
Yeah, we talked about that extensively last month. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
So I mean, and then and part of it has to do with the differences in the types of colonial experiences each of these countries had. And we know very clearly that like the French, they really fucked over. I mean, like, let's just be clear. I am not making an argument that any European form of colonization was more benevolent than any, but the French are a particular brand of bastard, right? And when they got kicked out, and when they got pushed out, and even like, and the Belgians, particularly horrible, because when Lumumba comes to power in the Congo, I think something like less than 7% of the adult population was literate in the country. Like had a
I don't even think it was that high. I think we were talking about that. I think there was like 16 college graduates or something like that.
It was ridiculous.
Yeah, like they were very, even within the concept of underdevelopment, like the underdevelopment was extreme. But when we talking about with Sekou Toure, when they got independence, the way that the colonizers just destroyed everything, like how y'all gonna tell us to leave? Like it's. I
mean, they had a temper tantrum. It was like we pulling out light bulbs, we taking out toilets,
telephone.
Like, we do,
like I talk about
not funny, but
like it's just So I think those histories are important because, again, when we're thinking about the Hotep image, and I'm using that in the colloquial term, like we don't really associate it with none of that. When we think about Africa, 1,000 years ago, again, those things matter, but I think what particularly the Nkrumah Toure's interpretation of Pan-Africanism tries to give you a material base for these things, so you're not just kind of lost in the wind. But for people who might
also, go ahead. But I wanted to add though, but the other thing that was important to them is that while Nkrumah and Sekou Toure and Modibo Keita, and we can kind of go across the board, while they understood that their people were distinct, they also understood how continuing to perpetuate the ethnic, religious, linguistic distinctions for people was not useful for the goal of uniting, right? And so I think sometimes their desire to see a united Africa gets misread as an intentional kind of flattening of their own people, which was not at all the case. But it was just like, these are petty distinctions that are being utilized against us. And we have to really recognize how they're being used against us so that we can overcome the continued nature of our oppression, right?
Yeah,
and so the argument was that, not that we ain't different, it's that we have to make those distinctions matter less.
Yeah, and it's like, even with like when you're talking about their advice to Lumumba, one of the things was with his particular party, with the MNC, was to push unity for all Africans in the Congo, not just whatever ethnic group, which was still even that was its own colonial thing, because they locked those ethnic tribes into a particular base to have the buffers to control folks. So like he emphasized like unity amongst the whole, because there was a lot of parties even when independence was happening, and this wasn't just in the Congo. There's a lot of parties that we just speak for our ethnic group. We want independence, but we just speak for our ethnic group, and we're the party that represents said ethnic group, as opposed to we're the party that represents like the entirety of this nation. And I know nationalism, and that's another conversation, but at least if you're gonna do nationalism, at least like actually do nationalism and include everybody that lives there.
Yeah, exactly.
At least do that.
That's literally, and when we think about the sort of worst atrocities that were committed on the continent, the Europeans' hands were never out of it, but that seemed like Europeans' hands weren't in it, was due to exacerbating nominal tensions that existed between ethnic groups that got turned into something else, right? So there's a real material history for the desire and understanding the need to collapse these distinctions between one another. Not to say that the people are all the same, but to say that we are being exploited and oppressed on the basis of the way we are understood as Africans.
Right.
And so whether we are Fula or Mandinka or Igbo or whatever, these people don't care about that. They are exploiting all of us in these ways. And all they do is take advantage of the ways that we understand ourselves as distinct from one another.
Yeah. And I mean, my next question was about distinctions, but I think you answered that as far as like, why do these distinctions matter? Like, no, it was good, because I think, and I just think lastly, before we get to the debate, which I'll explain to the audience, but like, it's just it's very liberal for folks who want to individualize, like, I'm not African, or I'm, and they take it as like someone's trying to impress them by giving them a name or putting them in a category. It's also just very immature, because like for folks who have a certain age, it's like, I'm Bob, or I'm whatever your name is, and I get to operate as Bob, and you can't tell me anything. I'm not, because that's just materially, that's not how the world operates. And if anything, if it's not to say that there aren't overreaches sometimes with this kind of thing, and people don't try to impose stuff on folks, but in general, or as it should be practiced, to even have any like individual autonomy, you have to have group autonomy. Like, I think that's the part that gets lost. Like, you don't get to just walk out in the world if there's not some kind of a collective agreement to even have protection for you. And if you don't have that, then your ability to walk into the world and be unencumbered is going to be, lessened by a lot. And I think for African people, like, I think we can see that, no matter where we are, like, your ability to walk out and even be the individual that you claim you want to be is limited, because you don't have that group power in general. And I think that gets lost when people like, well, I don't know nothing about Africa, or, I don't do that, or, I'm from Missouri, or, what I mean? So whatever.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you don't know nothing about Africa because you choose not to.
Yeah.
You can lie.
Well, I think their idea of it is just, I'm gonna lose myself in this. I don't get to be me. Like that's how, and again, it's a very liberal tendency that gets promoted, is I don't get to be that, or I have to be some fake, Kunta Kinte kind of character. Like I don't get to, it's because we do see, I mean, to be fair, we were talking about the Hotep thing, but there's a reason that critique exists, because there are definitely people who walk around and take Africa and they just wear beads, and the reason that resonates with people so much is because those people are real. Those just self-righteous, like self-interested, talking down to folks. Those are very real people. Like I mean, that's why a lot of folks are turned off to it. But we're saying should not judge it simply off of that. I think when we talk about Kwame Ture, he says you judge things off its principles. If you were to judge Christians as Christians, then there's no utility. And if you judge anything by its worst representatives, then everything sucks.
Exactly. I do just want to, just because you brought it up, and I think I brought it up earlier too, like the clothing, the naming, all that kind of stuff, those become like these staple archetypes, whatever, images of Afrocentricity. But I also do want to know like where that stuff comes from, right? Because that comes again, I think, from a very real response to things, right? Like when we think about the notion that so African people prehistorically get depicted as like always having been sort of out in the bush, not clothed or whatever, where a lot of people don't know that the Congo has a vast, long history with textiles, right? Even in a climate where things were warm, we do have these really long histories of processes of adorning ourselves, or even thinking about like hair, right? Like I remember, I think one of the reasons why like I have a thing for beards now has to do with even the way my father politicized keeping his beard when he was growing up. Because there's this notion of a clean shaven person who looks neat, who looks presentable.
Right.
And obviously there are even religious parallels for this, right? But that in a lot of ways, for a lot of Black men, because of the texture of their hair, this being clean shaven just really is not, it don't make sense. Like it don't make sense.
Nah, literally in some cases we break out. Like honestly, yeah.
Exactly, right.
Yeah.
And so there are all of these things that we, or even like choosing to look a certain way. Like when I go to work every day, I do wear African clothes. I do that because I think for me there is this constant battle about what is it that looks professional, and how do we determine, and why is what looks professional always a European Eurocentric standard, right? And so I think that there are these very I don't want to say it in a dismissive way, but there are these kind of surface level ways that we attempt to sort of reclaim a value based on the way that we have historically dressed, looked, adorned ourselves, whatever. And so there's use in that. But the problem is that when that becomes the full extent of the way you understand your relationship to Africa, and that I think is when it gets as less of a political statement and more of like, this is just, I choose to look this way, but I don't want to think about, the current political state of Africa. I don't know anything about what's happening in Burkina Faso and Guinea, Conakry. I don't know any of that. There's no present moment that's happening in Africa over struggle. It's just that, people treat me like shit here. And so to not feel like I'll get treated like shit here, I take on these symbolic kind of gestures to reclaim my humanity. Again, that has value, but it has to be more than that.
Right. And I think that speaks to the myth as far as how, that's well said, but as far as how like when we conflate these things, then it sometimes becomes reducible to what you just said. But there is virtue. And again, that's why I hate that these things get distorted, because there is virtue in these things, like by themselves. Like there's virtue in reclaiming your name. I mean, I wouldn't call myself too Black if I didn't have any, like, I know people think I'm just totally like this, materialist, monotone, whatever. But I wouldn't call myself that if I didn't find any value in these more self-affirming things, that still helps in a collective manner. But like you have to make a break sometimes, and what you call yourself, how you dress, how you speak, sometimes is a way of making a break. It's just when that gets, like you said, when that gets reduced to your only resistance, that you wore a kente cloth to work, it's just, that's when it's a problem. But I'm not saying don't wear it to work either, right? Like it can be both in, So
it
it must be.
Yes, it has to be both and.
Yeah. So yeah, today we talked a little more than we thought, but I thought that was a great conversation on the distinctions. So we want to revisit a debate that was had. We already discussed, Molefi, Asante, who coined the phrase Afrocentricity and wrote the book in 1980, and subsequent a lot of other books after that. Honestly, a lot of books after that. Regardless how you feel about him, he did write a lot of. He is one of the few people, in my opinion, who at least was willing to put his stuff on paper. A lot of us nowadays don't do enough job of like documenting our ideas, but that's neither here nor there. But say what?
The PhD program at Temple, I think it's now in Africology, I think is what they call it. But it is important. I mean, he was very instrumental in making the field of Black study a legitimate field of study in sort of higher ed. All of it's, good and bad, whatever that includes, but he was instrumental in doing that.
Yeah. There's contradictions, but that's another episode. So there was a debate between him and Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael. I don't feel like I need to give a deep background on who that is for this audience, but just briefly, more so for the sake of this debate, he's representing the All Africans People Revolutionary Party at the time of this debate. That's the most important thing. He obviously was part of many other formations, whether we're talking about SNCC, whether we're talking about briefly with the Panthers. So at the time, he's representing that particular party that comes out of the, Nkrumah's Toure's tradition. So this event itself is called Africa in the Future, but it's kind of known in the circles who are familiar with this debate as like Afrocentricity versus Pan-Africanism, and you kind of see the distinctions. So we don't have time to go over the entire thing because this episode would be like 4 hours long between our commentary and watching an hour and a half of them discussing it. So we're gonna pick certain clips and discuss, and then we'll leave this link in the show notes for those who want to watch the whole thing. All right, so Layla was actually at this event. Whether she wants to tell you,
we don't know that.
She just doesn't have any memory of it, but she was probably there. But
it's very possible. I will have to check with my dad.
Yeah. So yeah, we're just gonna go through a few clips to kind of give you, as the audience, like a sense of where these gentlemen were coming from. We're gonna start with Kwame Ture.
It came in two forms: slavery and colonialism. First, they took over 300 million, the strongest, out of Africa, and then they divided Africa at the Berlin Conference. So you can see that Africa herself was moving on this evolutionary process. This evolutionary process, which would lead to continental unity, and Africa will still be the first continent unified, was interrupted by European capitalism. Since it was interrupted by European capitalism and evolutionary process, the only way that Africa can unite today is through a revolutionary process aiming at a socialist economy. If capitalism destroyed us, it doesn't make sense to use capitalism to continue with it. We must use the antithesis of capitalism, which of course is socialism. And certainly if an evolutionary process has been interrupted, the only way we can capture the time lost is through a revolutionary process. We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Okay, one thing I always love about Kwame Ture is he had these vignettes. He'd wrap it up, and then he would get right to the next thing. It's just great, without sounding like some kind of soundbite person.
Master.
Yeah,
he's a master at public speaking. That is for sure.
You could chop this up into little segments if you want and learn from them by themselves, but it all comes together. So I'll just ask for your response on that, without asking any specific question, how that kind of speaks to this conversation we already have going.
Yeah, I mean, this I think is always okay. And so this, okay, how do I want to say this? I think that I struggled with other people's interpretations of Pan-Africanism, because this was literally the exclusive understanding of Pan-Africanism that I grew up with. And so whenever the term was utilized around me, it was never like, I wasn't, my parents were not they were of that generation. They chose to name all of us African names. My parents didn't change their names. They didn't exclusively dress in like African clothes. So that wasn't really my experience with thinking about Pan-Africanism. It was really about living in a place where we had to think about, okay, what are the economic systems, the economic structures that continue to oppress us, and how and what are the sort of ways out? And so I hear in this particular comment, when Kwame Ture is responding to what is this notion of Pan-Africanism, and it coming from this moment of the Berlin Conference where the African continent is balkanized, where it's broken up and it's carved out into pieces for the benefit of other peoples. And he literally makes this comment: the master's tools will not destroy the master's house. If capitalism is the thing that pushed us into this contemporary moment, it is not going to save us, right? And I know that you've done a number of shows on the sort of the wealthy Black class, the Black elite class, the Black artisans, whatever, and understanding that while, yes, we need money, we definitely need money to struggle, we cannot be struggling to put back into place the very systems that have created the extended forms of oppression that we live under today. And so his point here is not just that Africa must unite, because Africa must unite, but it can't just, it has to also unite moving towards a socialist economy, and a socialist economy being one that says that is not based upon the sort of exploitation, that is not based upon the accumulation of wealth on the backs of the labor and on the labor of other human beings, right? There has to be a particular kind of ethical way that we engage in creating resources and sustaining resources. And that's the only way we can imagine a true liberated freedom for Africa and African people. So that's what I hear him articulating in this clip.
No, I think that's a good explanation, because again, as we'll see later in this debate, this thing of socialism, and we've covered this on our show, as far as it's just inherently Eurocentric or white. That's not, I think I don't really need to get into that. Our episodes on that stand for themselves, but it does come up, regularly, and it still was coming up back then, as far as that's a white thing or whatever. But with what you just said, with what he just said, it's not even about even getting into that kind of debate. It's just to say, if you actually want to have a unified economy, you can't base that on exploitation, because that's the reason why you're here. So if you want to achieve the objective, then scientific socialism specifically is the way to go, and what I love about this is he's not even saying everyone has to go along with it. He's just making a very persuasive argument that this is the path, you can feel how you want.
You can let the bus ride past you, but this is the only way to get there.
Yeah, this is just the path. So it's important to know that, because again, a lot of folks don't associate Pan-Africanism at all with any kind of socialism. I don't even think it, because the idea to say that that's a white thing, but then the first country to become free, quote unquote, from colonialism, and then the idea comes from not scientific socialism itself, but this idea of unifying it with Pan-Africanism doesn't solely come from Nkrumah, but he definitely gives it a unifying path as far as thinking about it. So then to say that that's white is just funny to me, especially from people in America. I'm just you ain't get freedom and do shit, but you want to say that that's white, that's just an interesting way of framing it. But but yeah, it's I don't think a lot of us think about it in that sense, that you need to have shared principles on actually sharing the resources. Now there's other debates about socialism, African socialism, Ujamaa and all that. That's another conversation, but that's probably for another episode.
I always like the cut and dry: from each according to his or her ability, to each according to his or her need. That's just it, right? We understand that as human beings, we have in the course of the life cycle, we have more productive times in our life and less productive times in our life. As children and old people, we don't contribute in the same types of ways that younger able-bodied people do. And we know that, like, but we all move through those phases. So if we have a societal structure that says you are entitled to a dignified life because you exist, not based on how much sort of backbreaking labor we can exploit from you, you know that as a child you will be taken care of, and as an aging person who may be losing mobility or whatever those things are, you also will be taken care of because you will have done your part when you could contribute. And then again, that conversation is not even taking into account people with disabilities. But when you live in a society that you know that there are more than enough people that can produce to take care of those who cannot, you have to have a fundamental understanding that you have a responsibility to do those things, right? And I think that that's a part of what when people talk about communalism being the kind of foundational ideas about socialism, is that we already have a kind of innate understanding about a responsibility to one another, right? And how we care for one another, whether that be whether they're old, whether they're young, whatever, that we have a responsibility to take care of one another. That's the kind of society that we want to live in.
Yeah. No, I'm not even going to try to follow up with that. I think that's I just think, I think often when we talk about socialism, we get into these theoretical debates, but about economy and, Marx, but I think you're speaking to the heart of like why that would actually matter in real life. Because we have to take care of each other, and we all produce wealth. We all contributed, so we take care of those people. We don't just use them up and spit them out, which is what capitalism does. So yeah, that's a I'm just really want to just hit the kind of the foundational principles that he lays out, because unfortunately we can't go through it all. So here he speaks about this is mainly about the 5th Pan-African Congress. Now, if you want to lay out the ones prior, he does give a trajectory or a history of that prior to this moment, but this is the 5th Pan-African Congress in 1945 that played a pivotal role in a lot of anti-colonial struggles that followed.
Always been Africa. This must be properly understood. Some people try to shift it, take it somewhere else, but Africa has always been the focus. Du Bois carried on his congresses up until the 5th Congress in 1945. Because of time, we're just going through them quickly. In 1945, saw the 5th Pan-African Congress. Here, you had Africans born on the continent, in the Caribbean, and Africans, of course, born in Europe and the United States. At this 5th Pan-African Congress, there were 3 co-secretaries, of course, W.E.B. Du Bois, George Padmore of Trinidad, and Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. So you had an African from the Caribbean, one from the United States, and one from the continent, who were co-secretaries of the 5th Pan-African Congress. The 5th Pan-African Congress is crucial for us. A decision was made there. They said that the final confrontation with colonialism is coming. After all, this is 1945, and you must know that there's negative and positives in everything. I remember once as a young man reading Mein Kampf on an airplane, sitting next to a woman. She said, "What are you doing?" I said, "What do you mean what I'm doing? I'm reading Mein Kampf." "Why are you reading it?" I said, "Well, Hitler's a very important man. He had historical effects on the world, She said, "Well, I'm a Jew." I said, "Have you read it?" She said, "No." I said, "Oh, that's bad." I said, "Have you not read Sun Yat-sen?" She said, "No." I said, "He says the first law of war is to know the enemy. If I were a Jew, I would read everything there is to read on Hitler." Of course. So, while reading Hitler, she was arguing. I said, "Well, Hitler had some positive effect anyway." She said, "What positive effect did Hitler have?" I said, "Hitler weakened European imperialism. He weakened the British, he weakened the French, he weakened the Portuguese, he weakened the Belgians, and that's how we got independence." These are facts of life. These are facts of life. When Hitler got through with Britain, when the Indians said they want independence, Britain could do anything but get out the way and let them have independence. Matter of fact, they got Mahatma Gandhi quick because they didn't want to deal with the armed struggle that the Indians were preparing for British imperialism in India. And by the time India was free, well, it was over. China came up. After China, of course, Africa throughout, etc., etc. And by 1960, in 15 short years of the declaration of the 5th Pan-African Congress in 1945, 2/3 of the African continent was independent. You must understand clearly the importance of this. Now, at the 5th Pan-African Congress, they said the only solution to the final confrontation is mass organization. And I say, if you look at Africans, we have nothing but mass character in our struggles. Of course, this mass character for the moment is spontaneous and must be transformed to something that's planned and permanent. But certainly the mass character is there. If you just look back to the Rodney King situation, those Africans who rebelled en masse. They had no planning. That's how backward they were. They didn't think about it. Just on the spot, they said, okay, it's too much, let's go, let's get them. And everybody said, okay, let's get them. And we rise up as mass and we get them. And then we sit down for 29 years.
All right, so there we have the Fifth Pan-African Congress. Again, it wasn't a long history of it because I think only had like 15 minutes to speak in general. And then the point of mass organization, or he talks about mass character, but later on he gets to mass organization. So again, in trying to understand Pan-Africanism, how does the Fifth Pan-African Congress relate to that, and then the idea of organization, mass organization?
There's actually so much that he, like, re-listening to it, it's so much that he alludes to in just those, what did we listen to for like 2 minutes just then?
Yeah.
One, because so the thing about the conference, the Congresses and the conference, right? So the first Pan-African Conference, which Du Bois held, was in 1900, and that was almost exclusively an intellectual conference, right? It was literally, and I guess in that regard, that is more of a bridge between what the way I understand Afrocentricity now and the way I understand Pan-Africanism, right? Because it was an intellectual endeavor, it was much along the lines of sort of the work that Carter G. Woodson would later take up with the miseducation of the Negro, and thinking about literally the need that we have to focus on thinking about how people of African descent on the continent and the Caribbean and the Americas are thinking through our own problems, right? So that was very much an intellectual conference. The Congresses begin to take a shift where there's a much more of a sort of a populist, not just exclusively kind of elite academic intellectual space. But 1945 in particular, the Fifth Pan-African Congress, which takes place in Manchester, England, it becomes this because it becomes the first of those conferences that's really worker-oriented. They're bringing workers from the African continent into Europe. But the other thing because when he goes on that little tangent, it's not even a tangent, but when he starts talking about Hitler and Mein Kampf, we also have to think about what happens in 1945. Right. And he makes that comment about how many African countries gain its independence between 45 and 1960, right? But in these 15 years, and he makes that argument that when the white people fight amongst themselves is when we get a fucking break. Like, right. It was literally the fact that the fact that we even still call the European wars world wars is absurd, but because World War II is literally coming to an end and Europe is trying to figure out how to rebuild, they don't have the same amount of power and ability to continue to meddle in African affairs at that precise moment. Now, mind you, they come back around because neo-colonialism comes back with a vengeance. Yes, but yes. The reason why we see that sort of mass independence movement is because Europeans were turning inward and having to deal with themselves at that moment. And we see that again, like even when we look at in contemporary history, the Arab Spring, the pink tide across Latin America, every time these kinds of things start to push forward, it's because the Europeans are concerned with something else. And that, I think, is just from a sort of political theory standpoint, something that we need to take seriously. Like, and when he says, like, if I were a Jew, I would read everything of Hitler's, if we understand European colonization and neo-colonization and imperialism to be our enemy, we have to understand how it operates and how it ebbs and flows. And it ebbs when they're dealing with their own shit. And we have to be able to take advantage of it, right? And so the 1945, the Fifth Pan-African Congress really kind of signals this moment where there is a shift to thinking about the importance and the central role of workers, of labor unions, of all of these sort of logics that are going to help us continue to move away from this sort of path of exploitation and colonization and to a more self-determined future. So that's why that particular moment becomes so important, because and even the subsequent, I think, because the next one is in Tanzania, right? The sixth one is in Tanzania, I think. Right after the fifth one, because they don't happen.
And then by by 59, there's the All African Peoples Conference that is held in Ghana.
Yeah,
he talks about that on there too, and that's when there's actually free states by that time. And I think actually 58, but yeah, 58, and then they actually have several All African Peoples Pan-African or All African Peoples conferences. Like there's like a bunch in between that time, like 58 and 1960. And some of them are in Ghana, and they're held like really, I think, primarily throughout West Africa. I don't remember where the next one was.
Because there was the convention People's Party in Ghana, but then this also gets obscured a lot, is the amount of work that women were doing, and the conference and the women's conferences that they were having to explicitly have these conversations about the role that women needed to, should, and could play in African independence struggles. But again, like I just, I think when you made that mention about Kwame Ture speaking in the beginning, like there is just something about how neatly in a bow he can pull all those things together. Yep. Malcolm did that quite well too, also. Yep. But there was just a lot there, just even in those few minutes. But I think for me, always that kind of biggest takeaway is to sort of pay attention in the ebbs and flows of European interests and how we can take advantage of that. And I think even as that's something that we also have to think about as people who consider ourselves to be activist intellectuals or organizers, that, there will always be lows, right? But one of the things that Kwame Ture is also famous for saying is that, the masses of people always are already aware of the nature of our oppression. We may not always know what to do about it, but we're aware of it. So, and that's the reason why it's easy to mobilize us. But the organizing is the shit that takes real work, because, we know when fucked up shit happens. We know when things bubble to us. But those of us who are ostensibly spending our time thinking about these things, even when sort of mass uprisings are happening, we have to think about what are these moments that we can take advantage of. And I think that that's part of what he was signaling at in that snippet.
Yeah, you have to study the conditions and recognize what's there. From the conditions you can understand what needs to be done. But I think on the organizational part, I was having this conversation with somebody yesterday. I mean, there's a lot of debates on how that should work out as far as the organizational things, but I think I'm trying to think how to. I don't know. I think when it comes to organization, he's speaking to an audience, and at a time, again, this is in '96. I don't know if I said that. Where Afrocentricity
2 years before his death.
Yeah. And Afrocentricity and this the kind of like the way that we see it now, where people are kind of it's just a vibe, like that was really starting to sweep into the air in '96 and even prior. So the idea of joining an organization, and we won't be able to play some of that he talks about later, where, and even Asante actually pushes back on some of that when he talks about organization, because like it was just his idea with Afrocentricity that if I can just reconnect my African self, kind of to what we were talking about earlier, then that's really that's like the main goal. And he's like, nah, you have to actually like struggle in a different kind of way. And so this, in a weird way, this debate kind of falls into the typical idealist, materialist kind of, you mean, because he's speaking to more action. And when we get to Asante, you're going to hear more about, if you like ground yourself in Afrocentric principles, only then can you achieve any kind of Pan-Africanism or anything else. So play one more clip of him, and then we'll get to Asante, and then we'll kind of deal with some of the distinctions here. What is this? 19. Here we go.
There's no such thing as African socialism, Chinese socialism, Russian socialism, Arab socialism. There's only one socialism. The confusion arises over ideology. That is that which guides you towards your objective. So we're saying clearly here, Pan-Africanism is not an ideology. It is an objective. It is an achievable. Pan-Africanism is the total liberation and unification of Africa under scientific socialism. All we want is a unified continent with a socialist system. That's all. But you know, Africa is the richest continent in the world. When she's properly organized, she'll be the most powerful. Yeah, of course. Of course. And me, all I want is power. I'm not like others. I don't want money. I don't want popularity. I just want the power I'm supposed to get. That's all. That's all.
So that one was brief, but he said a lot there.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it was new to me, and I guess that's a testament to the world that was created around me. But it was new to me to actually think about Pan-Africanism as anything other than this, because this is how I always understood Pan-Africanism. But again, I think the important thing, and I guess you see more of it when we get to bring Molefi's conversation into it and what he's sort of responding to, is that, you know, I mean, principally, the kinds of Pan-Africanists that I was raised around, you know, have deep objections to certain operationalizations of things like negritude and Afrocentricity. Again, because of these sort of individualist notions, because of the kind of short-sighted nature of some of the things, but more than anything, because where is it taking us? Like there must be an objective, and if the objective is freedom, it's not just, you know, like these kind of notions of like enlightenment, individual enlightenment in the mind. We're talking about like freedom from material conditions of oppression. Like real things have to happen for us to become free. And like, and the thing is, and the thing about the question of unity under scientific socialism is because we also know that we are living in a world that no matter how hard we fight to get our freedom, continues to benefit from us not being free. And so we're not just fighting for our freedom, we're continuing to fight against people who don't want, who know that the very quality of their own lives will change by virtue of our ability to unify and to live a particular kind of dignified life. And so I think that point is just always trying to be driven home, that this is not just about our spiritual selves, our intellectual selves, our cultural selves, that it is about sort of real material conditions. And the only way to really improve material conditions is to actually fight for material resources. That has to do with land, you know, that's the land that we live on and the resources that come from it. And that also has to be done in a communalized way, right? We have to understand how resources are apportioned. And the way that we arrive at that is through an understanding of socialism.
Yeah, and I think, again, I'll say some of these critiques when we get to Asante, but I think that again, at the time, and I was very young when this happened, so I'm more so reflecting on what I've read and not so much, or what I've heard more so than you know, my own memory, because I was very young. But it appeared that and I think also with Afrocentricity in general, like the whole, not just Black thought, but a lot of thought in general had moved towards a more individualistic, even within other parts of the world, and other parts of intellectual thought had moved towards this kind of new age thinking that I think sometimes Afrocentricity can neatly fit into, that we don't have to struggle in that kind of way anymore. Like the way that he's talking about is kind of seen as an old guard, and actually and I think in many ways it's seen as that stuff failed. I think was the sense at the time, that Pan-Africanism, as the way you described it, as these more geopolitical projects, that stuff failed. And the reason it failed was because there wasn't a certain sense of self, or we didn't have the proper culture, or, you know, we couldn't unify because we were too Europeanized or whatever. That's why those things failed. None of that to me speaks to the actual material things that happen, like assassinations and stuff like that. But they would say that all of those things happened because people weren't in touch with their Africanness. So Lumumba is turned on by Mobutu because he didn't have a certain understanding of himself as an African, not because there were material bribes and, you know, interests that he needed to protect. And he was also just a, you know, a traitor, you know, so those things don't come into a conversation. So again, just to give people a sense of history, and even today, that's how we kind of tend to talk about these things, like back to Africa, that's unrealistic. Or we'll say, you know, all the African countries are corrupt, or, you know, so what we really need to do is more so understand who we are and have a better sense of that. And then, so everyone will still talk about unity, right? Like nobody walks away from that. I'm talking about people within these spaces. Everybody will say the word unity, but unity is more so like, if you can figure out yourself, there's this sense of, once I've done that, then there's this moment that will arrive. Again, for me, it does. I don't know what that is, but that seems to be
we will just reach nirvana, and we will all understand that we are spiritually connected beings who, you know, will feel each other's vibrations. Okay, I'm going. I'm gonna let it go.
But that's how it be, and it's like, to not necessarily defend it, but try to have a little more grace towards that perspective. If you zoom in, and because that's usually where it's just, since you're zoomed in, you're thinking about it like, yeah, I do need to have a better sense of myself and an understanding and appreciation to do anything. But, you know, this is where like this particular, like he talks about everything's positive and negative at once. So, you know, as an approach of dialectics too, where it's like, those are things you have to struggle through. You don't just like, you know, like read enough books. And he says it in this debate, and then, okay, now, you know, now it's time.
No, really.
You know, it doesn't.
What do you do with it?
Yeah.
You're not in community. You're not with people trying to figure those things out. And the thing is, being in community also requires that you have certain types of ethics about how you engage, from the smallest level to the bigger level. And if you're not able to enact those ethics in those small group organizational settings, we can be sure your ass will be corrupt if you get to power. So that's one of the reasons why we have to engage in organizations, because part of that stuff is stuff that you learn, trial by fire. Like, I personally do believe, this is just a belief, I do think as human beings, we lean towards a general good, like a general caring for ourselves, but we also live in a society that kind of takes that away from us. And so it is something that we constantly have to struggle with. And we have to struggle with that with people who we engage in a type of socialism in our family, in ideal family structures. We engage in a type of socialist exchange. Not all family structures are like that. But I do think we have to learn those politics. Like, we have to learn those ways of engagements on smaller levels where the stakes are a little bit lower. I actually think we can get to a point where as a society we can live like that. Like, we have to learn through those things. And then, like you said, it's not just gonna happen through meditation and sitting with ourselves. Like, we gotta struggle with each other.
Yeah. And I think capitalism, American society has a tendency to push people towards that, like, and because there's a lot of terrible things that happen with the collectives of people, so you just, you know, more and more you retreat into yourself, and I'm gonna just worry about me, you know. And again, that's not always a bad thing depending on what you came out of, but if you're trying to achieve any real power, like he says, you're not gonna get that by, you know, aligning your chakras and, you know, and not like it's just not gonna happen. I'm sorry, like, you know,
it's not. As a person, and I practice yoga and I love it, and it does help me. But the one thing that is clear about what yoga is that they always say it's about finding peace in yourself in a sea of chaos. What that says to me is that you're not doing anything about the chaos. All you're doing is attempting to control how you respond to it. There's use in that, because because shit is really killing us. Like, we do have to figure out how to continue to live in spite of all the things that are coming at us all the time. But again, it's not enough. It's not that it's not useful in and of itself. It's just not enough, right?
Yeah, it's part of it. And that's part of the tension of this debate is we never want to get to a point where we say culture don't matter, or your individual sense of self doesn't matter, and you just throw yourself up to the collective and give yourself away. You don't ever retreat back into your own sense of peace. Like, that's not what's being said here. I just want to make sure to clarify that, it's just the way that these things become over reliant for revolution and for any real freedom. That's where it becomes a problem. It's not that even idealism is necessarily all bad. It's that when that becomes the foundation of things, not that you don't, it's okay to have ideals, but when that becomes the foundation of how we understand things, that's when it becomes a flaw. All right, so that's it for that. We're gonna do Asante, and then we're gonna explore a few of the moments and then try to get out of this, because we could be here forever on this particular debate, if you want to call it that. So here he is. This is Molefi Asante defining just some of the terms of. I'll let him speak for it. All right.
As much that he said tonight that I take a lot of exception to. I am normally not used to debating people that I agree with so much. I mean, they normally have me pitted with Dinesh D'Souza or Arthur Schlesinger or Mary Lefkowitz or somebody like that. But tonight, I'm really delighted to be able to explain what I think might be some differences in the discussion that we have heard from Kwame Ture. Afrocentricity is the theory that says that African people can never achieve unity until we first have consciousness. Consciousness precedes unity. Unity operates on the basis of common interests and objectives. The African world, indeed African people here in the Caribbean, on the continent of Africa, all of us have been moved off of our own terms, psychological terms, political terms, economic terms, philosophical terms, cultural terms, linguistic terms, fashion terms, name terms, whatever. We've been moved off of our terms. We're not operating on our own terms, normally. When you are moved off of your terms and you are not operating on your own terms and you do not view yourself as an agent, that is, as an actor, as one capable of acting in any context, then you will never be able to create Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism, or any movement, must first of all fundamentally be based on the notion that individuals see themselves as subjects, as center, not as objects on the margins of Europe, not on the fringes of the European experience, not imitating or following after Europe, but are centered in their own African experience as African people and view themselves from that particular perspective.
All right, so again, we're here, even though obviously you and I have our biases as far as where we lean, it's important to still let that stand for what it is. Like, that does give you some foundational understanding of Afrocentricity, and there and again saying that we need to have a certain understanding of ourselves, and if we can't have that understanding, then these goals that we want to achieve will fail on their own premise, because we don't have that understanding of ourselves, of our Africanness, of our of our heritage, of all our ideas, because we're rooted in the culture and the ideas of our enemy. That's, I think, a fair summary of what he said. Now, again, people can have their opinions on it, but I'm just saying, so people can understand the distinctions. That's a good explanation of kind of like what Afrocentricity is trying to achieve, regardless how you feel about it.
Yeah, and I mean, and again, like we've said this, I think there is truth in that. There is some truth in that you're not going to get people to become unified who don't see a need for unity. And seeing a need for unity is both about understanding ourselves in the positive sense, but it's also about understanding, because this is the thing about like the term Black, right? And even why like as a Pan-Africanist, I think it's important to utilize the term African, but there is something also I think about that, about Blackness, that just it comes into being, and it is this category that kind of collapses us all together, that creates a sort of without distinction. But again, it's not that we don't have distinctions; it's that we are all oppressed based on this reading of ourselves. And so I think that in that sense, as a project in that regard, Afrocentricity has its uses. I do think it's very important. But again, and then what? And then what? So that's where I'll stop.
I think one thing that does, I will say, just from watching this a million times now, I just noticed even today, sometimes the things that have an easier entry point are what grabs us, and this does have an easier entry point than somebody who's like, we got to do scientific socialism, and you, like I'm saying, if you're walking into the room, you ain't never heard none of this sounds way more palpable to what you as an individual can do, as opposed to what Kwame Ture is talking about. I'm not saying that means it's better. I'm just saying that if I'm entering, especially if I'm younger and I don't really know myself that well, this does give me, I understand why people can be susceptible to it, regardless of whether of its futility or not, because like you walk in, or its utility, excuse me. If you walk in and they're like, yeah, you can't really do nothing if you don't know who you are. You know, like I'm saying, I understand why that is appealing for people versus you got to join an organization, you got to take all these risks. You know what I mean? So, and he's just like,
no, it is.
Yeah.
It is. I mean, but it's also important, right? Because you do have, like, he started off with saying that African people need to see themselves as subjects. Like, of course, but like I said, so much of this is a response to the fact that we have been forced to not understand ourselves as subjects, because we know we are active agents in history. Like, we know these things, but we have been convinced by the greater society that we live in that we somehow we don't make great contributions. And so in a lot of ways, again, this is a response to that. And as much as I made the argument earlier that it is a black a black US experience that he really is responding to, I don't want to ignore the fact that colonialism did the same type of number on African peoples on the continent that enslavement did to us this side of the ocean. And so it isn't like I would be cautious of people who make an argument that just because they grew up in Africa, because they grew up in a place where they saw a bunch of Black people, that they have an active positive image of themselves as well. Because one of the things that always really that I struggle with is really disheartening to me when I speak with people who grew up on the continent. And when we talk about these issues, the first thing that a lot of people like to bring up is the corruption of African leaders. But again, because I was on a panel last week on Black feminism, Black freedom, and somebody asked a question about poverty. And one of the things that always comes up for me is that we can't get to the right solutions if we don't ask the right questions. And if we're only asking questions about corrupt African leaders, and we're not asking questions about who's propping up these corrupt African leaders, and to whose benefit or service are they doing this for, then we can't get it, because part of what it reads as to me is that people are buying into this notion that we are somehow innately inept and corrupt. And when people are not looking at these sort of larger structures behind it, why, like, they're puppet presidents. They're puppets for the particular reason, and because they are upholding other people's interests, not their own people's interests, right? So I just want to be clear that there's use for this on both sides of the ocean, even though I think the way Molefi promotes Afrocentricity does focus a lot more on the U.S. Black experience.
Yeah, I think it still, tends to come back to us. And again, some of that I think is just because of who the creator is and where the creator's from, but there was this athlete, I can't remember his name. He's a former athlete. He's on one of those Fox Sports shows, and he was on Van Lathan. I don't watch it, but I saw it on Twitter, and he was saying something to the effect that I don't come with the same cultural baggage because I'm from Nigeria that a Black American, this is his words, may come with. And Van Lathan, who's another podcaster, spazzed on him.
It's just wrong. That damn British colonial education system. Stop.
Right.
Stop.
So he just spazzed on him, like, bro, that's not like, and it also was just this thing. He's just playing to that model minority kind of like, I'm not like the Black people here. Like I'm not angry about slavery. Like you weren't colonized. You know what I'm saying? Like you're not still colonized. So
Exactly.
That's
Look, all the proof we needed of their colonization was the number of people who were former British colonial subjects giving a fuck about the Queen. Okay, that's all the proof we need of the nature of their continued colonization. That's there.
Yeah.
On the internet for people to see.
Yeah. That was sad. All right, so I think that gives us like a foundational thing. Now, this is where these ideas start to intersect between the two of them when he makes this claim here about, he already kind of sets it up in what we just played, but then he goes further with his claim about Pan-Africanism. This is where things go anyway, I'll just play it.
Unity that would bring about, we have, as Kwame Ture has told us, since 1900, since Sylvester Williams, we've been talking Pan-Africanism. But you know why we have not had an effective Pan-Africanism operating? Because we have not had a philosophical base. Without Afrocentricity, you cannot have Pan-Africanism. You can have a discussion about it. You can have rhetoric about it. You have to have ideas. You must have interests. You must have institutions, mechanisms for carrying out Pan-Africanism. But you cannot have ideas or interests or institutions until you have African people on the same page. Negroes do not talk to Africans. And Black people don't want to have anything to do with colored folk. And on the continent of Africa itself, we are suffering today in the fratricidal wars on the continent itself because we do not have a philosophical base. I mean, the Hutu and the Tutsi. This is a good example. The intervention of Europe has created a situation that has not allowed consciousness. We don't have the same mission in mind. And that's why we don't have any African governments. I lived in Zimbabwe, not as long as Kwame has been in Guinea, but I lived there. But I didn't see an African government there. I wonder whether or not we have one in Guinea. I haven't been there, I can't say that. But in the other countries, 27 countries I've been in, I haven't seen any African governments. What I have seen African people in government. I have seen African people running government, but I have not seen an African government because African people do not yet have an Afrocentric philosophy.
Yeah. I saw your face on that one, so I'm gonna just let you speak to that.
I mean, well, there's a lot of things because on the one hand, he's right. Like, what, and we don't. We're gonna talk about this more, right? But also when he makes this comment, he's talking about Zimbabwe under Mugabe, and we know that Kwame Ture goes to Guinea because of his relationship to Sekou Toure and Kwame Nkrumah. And that he lived through a period where that was a reality, and reality was taken away. think I don't know what it is. Is it a level of arrogance? I don't know, because there were governments that were attempting to be African governments for African people. And again, there's just a level of, I think, historicity to it. When he says, I haven't, this is what, 1996?
Mm-hmm.
No, in 1996, we don't see that at that moment because of what's happening in that moment. But it's wrong to say that it's never been. And it's also wrong to ignore the fact that the reasons why it no longer is was not some kind of partially, but it wasn't just about a sort of internal breakdown, that there were active forces working against maintaining that, right? Like the reason why Patrice Lumumba became public enemy number one is because he was attempting to unite his country and utilize the resources that were there in the most resource-rich country on the continent for the benefit of its own people. And that's why you get them to come and get somebody like Mobutu Sese Seko to come in and take advantage of that shit, right? So there's truth to what Asante is saying, but I still find it problematic because I feel like it's ignoring all of the efforts that were pushing towards regional and continental unity that were attempting to create governments by and for people. Again, and this is the same thing I say, because you also know that my research in Latin America and Venezuela, like nobody's making the argument that Nkrumah or Sekou Toure or Patrice Lumumba or Modibo Keita or Samora Machel did every single thing right. Mm-hmm. No, we're never making those. Like there are plenty of things to be debated about how they engage with dissent and all these other things, but we also can't just have those conversations without taking seriously what they were up against. And when you're attempting to build something that is the antithesis of everything that those in power want to have, like you have a different kind of battle. And so I with Molefi's idea that there was not a burgeoning conscious, like there was a consciousness that was being built amongst the people. And to say that you can't have that without it basically says that it kind of ignores the history of all of this work to build continental unity and the reasons why it was undone. And so that's why I take issue with the overarching argument, even though there are nuggets of truth there.
For one, just on his face, just dealing with this fundamentally without even getting into any deep history. You wrote a book on Afrocentricity in 1980. So everybody beforehand that did anything didn't, they couldn't achieve Afro or Pan-Africanism because you hadn't written a book yet. I mean, that's essentially.
Oh, who are you? Are you Muhammad? Did you have a message from the top? Like what? Like how did you arrive at Afrocentricity? Like you clearly learned something from somebody.
Yeah, I'm gonna let, since they are debating, I'm gonna let I found the clip I was talking about.
Well, the first question is very easy. I arrived at Africanism without going through Afrocentricity, so I don't know how I got here, but I got at Pan-Africanism without going through Afrocentricity. I didn't go through Afrocentricity to get to Pan-Africanism. I arrived straight at it, and Pan-Africanism has been around a long time before Afrocentricity. We said the first Pan-African conference was in 1900. Just because we've not achieved Pan-Africanism today doesn't mean it's not achievable. That sounds like maybe you've got some confusion with the American capitalist system of everything is instant, instant coffee, instant this, instant replay. But freedom is not instant, it is an eternal struggle. Therefore, from 1900, therefore from 1900 up until now, and I began by showing you that it started when we were first interrupted. Do you think that the Africans who were put into slavery were not fighting for Africa? They didn't fight, they waited until Afrocentricity? No, the struggle continues. Afrocentricity is only a term. It doesn't give the content of the struggle is always there. There's a scientific law. Wherever there's oppression, there is resistance. Even if you cannot detect it with the naked eye, there is resistance. Look at the United States of America. They went all over talking about their NAFTA thing. They thought they had everything under control. January 1st last year, the Chippewas jumped up, started shooting up everywhere. Where did they come from? Wherever there's oppression, there's resistance, even if you don't detect it with the naked eye. And I know that wherever Africans have been oppressed, we fight. Multiform, but we fight. So I don't understand that point. Capitalism and socialism also seems to be a tendency here, the Afrocentrists.
I'll come back to that. But yeah, like I mean, I think he kind of settled it there, but I'm just saying it doesn't. I mean, it's just. I'm just saying, even before we get into any of the deeper history, it's like, how can you claim that? How can you make a claim like that? You know, when you're a Johnny come lately compared to the longer history, like you can't. And then it also assumes even if we took a more graceful interpretation, what he was trying to say, that essentially our problem is we don't have a guiding ideology, and we need to have that. In order, we have to have ideas, we have to have things that we can agree on, and that's part of the problem, is we haven't had that, and that's why we haven't achieved it. So even if we took Afrocentricity out of it and gave a more graceful interpretation, just to say, even if we didn't call it that, we need some kind of like guiding principles and ideas. That's not true either.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, that's just that's just not true. Like, there's plenty of folks, if anything, we've broken off and splintered because of ideas for a long time, because we've always struggled over ideas, so that just, yeah.
I mean, yeah, that's the thing. Like, is when I talk about it in abstract sense, I really like to give a lot of space and grace for when I think about Afrocentricity, because like you said, there are a lot of people who come to their own kind of radical and or revolutionary Black African politics through Afrocentricity. But again, I just think it's a stopping point. Like, I think it's a place that a lot of people got to pass through, but it ain't the end. It ain't the end goal. It's not the destination. It's a pit stop. And like I said, it's the difference between Kwame Ture and Molefi Asante in this instance, as an organizer and what's the word? Not even intellectual, but as an academic, because I really want to be clear about as an academic and who like he's accountable to as an academic. I think that's a lot of why we see that distinction. I think we see Kwame Ture's theorizing from the place of being in community with people. And we see Molefi Asante's theorizing about Afrocentricity from the place of sitting, reading books in a corner, writing by himself. I think that really is, I think, the kind of crux of the difference.
Yeah, again, this isn't an episode meant to go hard on Afrocentricity, so I'm trying to resist that tendency to just like say everything I have to say on that, because I think we're trying to make the distinction. But I do think there's something to be said about just, without getting too deep into it, I just think people need to do the actual history on these things. And when you look, like Kwame Ture lays out, that there's always been struggle, there's always been resistance that's embedded in our history. Sometimes this view of our history that everything has just been stolen from us and we have to reclaim it. I don't always agree with that interpretation in general. I don't know if that's actually, I think things are much more messy than that I just need to reclaim all of these things that I don't already have, that didn't somehow stay with us. It doesn't exist in any form, and I just need to reclaim those things. Like, I think that kind of interpretation of history, or even that kind of sense of what needs to be done, I think that's part of why we say it's a stopping point. I think you can just keep doing that. Like, you never really get out of that, like trying to reclaim. So a lot of these conversations today, even the more service-based level stuff about cultural appropriation and all, like it always comes back to this, like, things have been taken from us and we got to claim them back in this kind of like intellectual or just philosophical sense. But we don't get to the actual material resources that have been taken. Like, that doesn't seem to be an actual struggle. So we always are like, we got to take back the fact that white women can wear braids or something, and now we got to be able, we got to take, like, it's always these cultural things that I think on a subconscious level, I think it's just easier to navigate, because again, like I was saying, coming back to, he's saying you got to join an organization, and like I think some of us just don't really want to take those risks. Like, I mean, that's just my opinion. I just don't think it's just something that I don't think we either want to take those risks, or we don't think those risks are actually necessary. We think that's an extreme.
Hard.
Yeah.
it's hard. It's hard to be in community with people. Like it
Yeah.
really is. It's easy to sit alone and do things exactly the way you want to do them. But when you're really struggling to build things together, like it's hard because you're not just accountable to yourself. Like you actually got to take into account what other people think, how they feel. And that shit is not easy.
No, it's not. I mean, because there's constant contradictions. You know, there's constant understandings, interpretations. There's people who are going to be people, you know, and you're going to be a person right back to them. And that's not always going to be nice, you know, and people going to do shit that's just, you know, I mean, that's just living life. And that's just how it goes. Like, it's not going to be a perfect thing. And I think that when we talk about ideas, that's another problem with idealism is like it tends to assume if you just gave people the right ideas that they'll just kind of behave correctly. And that's not always what it is. It doesn't mean ideas don't matter though. Like that's something that he
Exactly.
also addresses. Like ideas are very important, probably more important to us because so much has been taken from us than even within some other groups, you know, particularly with European like socialists who don't maybe see the importance of ideology so much other than just thinking about it in a strictly materialistic sense, you know. Like for us it's a little different, but that doesn't mean you can just, you know, just insert the right idea and things will just kind of correct themselves around it. All right, that's it for part one. Tune in part two. We're going to get into the end. There's a little bit more on this debate that we cover in part two. And then we're going to talk about the so-called Pan-African conference in Ghana and, you know, some of the other occurrences that are happening that might be a more material reflection of Pan-Africanism, if you at least following those developments. But I hope you enjoyed the conversation. You'll see y'all next week. Peace.
Okay. Fresh out the plane in a whole nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the state.